For those of you who don't know me from the Nordic Sound podcast, my name is Jameson Foster, and I am an ethnomusicologist studying at the University of Colorado Boulder. While I'm a specialist in Nordic music traditions more broadly, one could say that my expertise is in the pagan revival brought on by various folk, metal, and medievalist music genres since roughly the 90s in Scandinavia, though some impulses of it started earlier and elsewhere, of course. And it is to this subject, this field of study, that this channel and its accompanying blog will be dedicated. As an ethnomusicologist, the nature of my work involves participation in this movement to better understand the human element to this growing revival. Visiting festivals, engaging with the communities both online and physical, getting to know musicians, or learning firsthand how and why participants experience the music and make meaning from it, which they may or may not carry on into their lives outside of the musical experience. In other words, learning about this pagan revival through engaging with the human element firsthand, and using these real human experiences as data of sorts, and that is what we call ethnography, simply speaking. And don't fret over the particulars of what ethnography is just yet. That's for the next video and the next blog post. For now, it just means that I study the ins and outs of culture through the people who are a part of that culture. As it stands, I am one of the only ethnomusicologists that I know of who is studying the 21st century pagan revival through the ethnographic viewpoint. Some has been written on pagan music by musicologists such as Scott Troyer, Kirsten Yeary, and Helen Dell, but none of these works are ethnographies. The result is writing which lacks the experiential element of the people in the culture they're writing about, though their work is of course valuable in other ways to which I am indebted in my own work. But another way of thinking about this is that much has been written on modern-day heathens by folks who don't actually spend a lot of time around those heathen communities. And I do not mean to imply through this either that ethnography is the only worthwhile way to study cultural movements, but most of us can agree that to write about a culture without interacting with it in any meaningful way can pose some potential problems of representation. Representation becomes a more problematic issue with countercultures because they are constantly being misrepresented to the general public through what Foucault calls the regime of truth. In my many years of representing this community as an academic, I've found that it is the case to write off these communities as delusional, regressive, and while this is certainly the case for some portions of the movement, to allow the entire movement that spans many countries and an incredibly diverse group of people by this one stereotype would be insincere and, from an academic standpoint, ethically untenable. The truth is much more complicated. Along with the imperfections and contradictions of the pagan revival movement, there is an admirable desire to make things better than how they are by looking to the past for inspiration to create a better future. And the tendency to default to a skeptical or critical stance of countercultures such as this is not really a coincidence. The powers that be don't want things to change because they benefit and profit from the status quo, however awful that status quo is. And then to safeguard their own interests, they then invest a lot of time, effort, and money into declawing or invalidating any critiques which might threaten their claim to legitimacy through that very regime of truth Foucault talks about, which ultimately gets to decide what is real, what is true, and what is not. This regime of truth is what the pagan revival movement and so many other countercultures are in constant struggle against. And this will be a recurring theme as the blog and this channel develops. To leave it for the moment to those looking in from the outside, curious but not a part of this movement, I hope that in learning about these people, this music, and their ideologies, you will come to find that many of the prejudices and biases and preconceived notions you might have against modern heathens to be unfounded, or at the very least, a little bit more complicated than initially thought. This leads me to another element of ethnomusicology that I was recently reminded of by Dr. Brenda Romero when she gave a keynote speech at the regional conference here in the Rockies, and that is that ethnomusicology is disruptive. While ethnography began as a means of imperial control, in the 20th century became a means of disrupting normativity, the status quo. For so long, European exceptionalism cultivated a belief that everything we did was either of our own invention or that we did it best. The thing about illusions like this, though, is that they rarely survive contact with the outside world or reality. And through ethnography, though, we've learned so much about the ways that the peoples of this world believe, act, and live that it makes any normative fallacy really untenable. In other words, learning about other people through other people will disrupt our own normative thinking in a potentially powerful way that can lead to some productive change, ideally. Now, this clearly isn't always the case, as normativity cultivated by white supremacy and Euro-exceptionalism still persist, buried in like a little tick, but that doesn't mean that the project is futile. If anything, it gives it a little bit more urgency. So at its most basic, I hope that this heathen ethnography is disruptive to those who read it, especially to those looking in from the outside. Now, by nature of being an academic in the university system, an apparatus of this regime of truth, most of my work is written for and read by other academics. This is just the nature of academia, for better or for worse. Through my work on the Nordic Sound, though, which teases hints of my scholarship through the interviews on that podcast, many of you reading this have expressed interest in my finding a way to make the ethnomusicological work I do on especially heathen and pagan music more accessible in a dedicated place, rather than piecemeal through interviews with other musicians. And considering that curiosity and desire to learn is one of my favorite hallmarks of modern heathens, in other words, so many of us are just really dorks who love reading, I've given this prospect months of thought. And simply put, how can I make this heathen ethnography not just available to those who are curious, but how can I also make it useful for those who read it or watch it? Moreover, what interesting things can happen when that ethnographer is himself also a participant. And it reminded me of what made the Nordic Sound take off in the first place. A series of vlogs I did from Midgårdsblot 2022 for my then audience of about 70 subscribers. I recorded the videos, sent them off to the YouTube sphere, then went about my day. When I got back home from Norway, though, imagine my surprise when the Dinky Music History channel doubled its subscribers and got thousands of views in just a couple days from those vlogs alone. Now, while that was never the intent of the Nordic Sound, the interest, or dare I say demand, for some sort of ethnographic perspective on these festivals is clearly there. And then 3 years later, it's yet to be taken up by anyone else. Nor do I really think it could be taken up by anyone else. Responsibly, at least. So here I am with Dirt Worship, the blog. I know, it's a funny name and it's not the most elegant to say, but something about it captures the spirit of the 21st century pagan revival in an inclusive way, without favoring a particular persuasion or identity. Despite the diverse flavors of heathens today, Wiccan, Nordic, Celtic, Slavic, just to name the big four, they do share an environmentalist bent inherited from the 60s folk revival, which all of this stems from in the first place, though we don't always think of it in that way. And not always in practice, but at least in ideology, there is a reverence and longing for the natural world in heathen circles. It's not a coincidence why I chose to hike up here and record the video here. And I wanted to highlight this restorative, optimistic side of the revival, which is so often overlooked in more critical commentaries and scholarship on modern heathens and modern pagans. Dirt worship also has an innocence to it, I think, a charm even, that I think will keep that anchored quite nicely. And this is also why, going forward, I will opt for heathen rather than pagan, with the former having a softness to it that fosters a different kind of discussion. Besides, we don't need another Norse-centered paganism blog or channel, even if the core concept of ethnomusicology is novel. I think we can all agree on that. Which brings me to the elephant in the room, so to speak. This movement is already full of great public scholars, all offering something that can't be imitated. Rune Hjarno Rasmussen's Nordic Animism and Mathias Nordvig's Sacred Flame in particular come to mind, covering the religious and historical scholarship, and are both very influential and have inspired me quite a bit. And also Daniel Farron's Nordic Mythology podcast further adds more value in giving true experts a platform for their niche research that is nonetheless valuable, but doesn't often find a dedicated space to communicate its ideas and its findings. But a crucial dimension of modern heathenry, music, is notably absent from the picture here, with me doing the best that I can over on the Nordic Sound, which doesn't dedicate itself to one particular style. And this is all despite music's indisputable role as the emulsifier, which brings and holds this movement together. Concerts, festivals, album releases continue to be ground zero for the modern heathen experience. And in the hopes of understanding this music and how it means for those who make it and listen to it, yet another perspective can be added to the growing collage of public scholarship on modern heathen practice through an ethnomusicologist's observations. And this is the role that I hope to fulfill through Dirt Worship, this YouTube channel, with more depth and focus than I can with the Nordic Sound. Heathen ethnography by a heathen ethnographer, in other words. And in practice, it will look quite similar to what you're used to from the aforementioned scholars, and even the Nordic Sound in some cases. But as I conduct my own work as an ethnomusicologist, certain big picture ideas come into frame that I feel worth sharing with heathens, or not, who might find some value in the conversation to be had around that topic. There have already been a few mentioned here, and my aim is to then take those big picture ideas that we all observe in the heathen revival and frame them within certain theoretical frameworks, in other words, scholarship, academic work. Memory, nostalgia, and enchantment will be recurring themes, but assuredly others will also crop up as this project unfolds. There's been an increasing discussion in ethnographic studies since the turn of the century to give back to the communities we study, given our history of merely collecting data then disappearing into the ivory tower to use it to whatever ends that we have in mind. In other words, it's mostly been a relationship void of reciprocity, only ever taking and rarely giving. And this is my way, I guess, of giving back and potentially showing the heathen communities what value, ideally, an ethnographer can give, and maybe enriching your own understanding of this community that we call our own. Though sometimes it can be weird to read about our own behavior in such a way, believe me, as an ethnomusicologist studying my own culture, there's an eerie existential element that is kind of hard to get used to. But it is my hope that this project will invite heathens to potentially think about what and why we're doing in a more intentional way, regardless of the initial discomfort of thinking about ourselves so self-critically. But the aim is not only to make this work accessible, but to quite literally invite heathens into a broader conversation to be had in an accessible way for the sake of discussion. I'm really hoping to foster a place for learning and further discussion here, not just me talking at a camera and you just absorbing it uncritically. That's not what I want this to be at any point. But I don't want this to be a formulaic thing either, only ever churning out hot and heavy theoretical writing. Back to the earlier example, I will also share field notes, as they're called in the trade, from the many festivals that I attend for field work. Just this summer, I have Cascadian Midsummer, Fire in the Mountains, and Midgårdsblot, and I plan to write reports from these festivals so that those who couldn't attend might be able to get a glimpse of the happenings there, or so those that did attend might gain something of worth from reading a different, more meta perspective from someone who was there specifically to observe and to study as an ethnomusicologist. But there's also the matter of where this blog will be found. YouTube and podcasts bring with them an implication of an entertainment element, as reluctant as we are to admit it. When given the choice, we will choose to be entertained every time. Conversely, the written word demands a certain slowness, a patience to sit with what's being communicated rather than something to be put on in the background while you do the dishes. The things communicated here, I feel, are best said without the expectation to entertain. But after some consideration from the first test readers of the blog, I will also concede the accessibility benefits of some kind of audio-visual medium. Further, allowing a visual medium gives me the flexibility to record vlogs on the spot at these festivals and events, and even maybe incorporate some interview guests every now and again. So with this in mind, I've started this YouTube channel to convert these blogs into videos as well here on YouTube, but without any pretense of spectacle which YouTube constantly demands. The backdrop for this video is probably going to be the closest thing to spectacle that this channel has. So what I've landed on is this. First and foremost, this will be a blog found on Medium, which is where most of my attention will go. But from these Medium posts, I will then make videos that can be found here on YouTube on this channel for those of you who benefit more from listening than from reading. The other benefit here is the presence of a comment section on either platform, which I welcome for further discussion and perspective, always with respect. And the third element will be the Instagram page at heathen.ethnographer, where I will be posting photography from these events accompanied by smaller blurbs and reflections. I look forward to seeing how this project unfolds. It could either turn into something pretty cool or fizzle out into another failed experiment. Fans of dirty musicology know that this wouldn't be the first time, though I will say dirty musicology paved the way for this, so it wasn't entirely a waste of time. There's also the looming dead internet on the horizon, so many could argue that this is the worst time in the internet's lifespan to start a blog or a YouTube channel, but I'll make the best of it in the meantime. Regardless, most of you know by now that I'll always be around no matter what the name of the project that I'm doing might be. So guys, thank you for watching. Feel free to write any comments or thoughts, anything down below, or directly to me at heathenethnographer@gmail.com. You never know what might start a really rewarding conversation. Thanks. Thank you for watching. Alright, so now with that out of the way, how about we sit here and enjoy a nice quiet moment together, huh?